Brother tried to have me declared dead to collect my life insurance policy. The process server who found me alive made his day very awkward. 3 months ago, I was sitting in my tiny apartment, eating cereal for dinner when someone knocked on my door with enough force to wake the neighbors. I opened it to find this middle-aged guy in a wrinkled suit holding a clipboard and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. He asked if I was me, using my full legal name, and when I nodded he just stared at me for what felt like forever with his mouth hanging open like he'd seen a ghost. Turns out my younger brother had been trying to have me declared legally dead for the past 6 months. The process server was there to deliver papers for a court hearing, where my brother planned to present evidence of my supposed demise to a judge. The poor guy kept looking at me and then at his paperwork, and then back at me like he was witnessing some kind of miracle or maybe having a stroke. My brother and I hadn't spoken in over 2 years after our parents died and left us their house. He wanted to sell it immediately and split the money, but I thought we should keep it in the family since it had been in our bloodline for 3 generations. The argument got so heated that we ended up not talking at all, which apparently gave him the brilliant idea that I must be dead since I wasn't responding to his calls or texts. The process server finally managed to close his mouth and asked if I had any identification to prove I was actually alive. I showed him my driver's license, and he took a photo of it with his phone while shaking his head and muttering something about this being the weirdest case he'd ever handled. He said he'd been looking for me for weeks and had almost given up when he finally tracked down my current address through some old utility records. After he left, I called the courthouse to find out what exactly my brother had been up to. The clerk explained that he'd filed a petition to have me declared dead based on the fact that I hadn't been seen or heard from in over a year, had no known address, and had supposedly abandoned all my personal belongings. He'd even provided witness statements from our mutual friends saying they hadn't seen me in ages. The irony was that I'd been living less than 50 miles from our hometown this whole time, just keeping to myself and working odd jobs to pay the bills. I'd gotten rid of social media after our parents died because it felt too painful to see everyone else's happy families, so I guess that made it easier for people to assume I'd vanished into thin air. What really got me was discovering that my brother had already contacted my life insurance company and filed a claim. The policy was only for $25,000, which wasn't exactly a fortune, but apparently it was enough to motivate him to go through this whole elaborate charade. The insurance company had been holding off on paying out until the court officially declared me dead. I decided to show up at the hearing unannounced just to see the look on his face. The courtroom was practically empty except for the judge, my brother, his lawyer, and a few random people waiting for their own cases. I walked in right as the lawyer was explaining to the judge why there was sufficient evidence to declare me deceased. My brother was sitting at a table facing forward, so he didn't see me come in. His lawyer was going through this whole presentation about how I disappeared without a trace and had clearly met with some kind of tragic end. The judge looked bored and kept checking his watch like he wanted to get through this quickly and move on to more interesting cases. When the judge asked if there was any reason why the petition shouldn't be granted, I stood up and said there was. The sound of my voice made my brother spin around so fast he nearly fell off his chair. His face went completely white and he started making these weird choking sounds like he was trying to speak, but couldn't get any words out. The judge looked confused and asked who I was. When I told him, he asked me to approach the bench and show identification. My brother's lawyer kept looking back and forth between me and his client like he was watching a tennis match. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was in some kind of dark comedy movie. The judge dismissed the case immediately and made some comment about this being highly irregular. My brother still hadn't said a word to me, he just sat there staring with his mouth hanging open. His lawyer packed up his papers in a hurry and left without even looking at either of us. After everyone else cleared out, my brother finally found his voice. He started rambling about how he'd been worried sick about me and had only filed the petition because he thought something terrible had happened. He claimed he'd been trying to find me for months and that the life insurance thing was just a coincidence. I didn't buy it for a second. If he'd really been worried about me, he could have hired a private investigator or contacted the police. Instead, he'd gone straight to the courthouse and the insurance company. The whole thing felt calculated and cold, like he'd been planning it for a while. We ended up having this awkward conversation in the courthouse hallway, where he kept apologizing and making excuses. He said he'd been struggling financially since losing his job and had been desperate. He claimed he never actually expected the insurance money to come through, and was just going through the motions to see what would happen. The worst part was that he seemed genuinely shocked to see me alive and well. Like he'd actually convinced himself that I was probably dead somewhere, and he was just making it official. He kept asking where I'd been and why I hadn't contacted anyone, as if disappearing from his life meant I disappeared from existence entirely. I told him I'd been living my own life and didn't owe him or anyone else an explanation for my choices. We weren't close anymore, and I didn't see any reason to keep him updated on my whereabouts. That seemed to hurt his feelings, which struck me as pretty rich considering he'd just tried to have me declared dead for money. The conversation got more heated when I brought up the life insurance claim. He tried to downplay it and act like it wasn't a big deal, but I could see the guilt written all over his face. He'd been counting on that money, and now his whole plan had fallen apart in the most embarrassing way possible. What really bothered me was finding out that he'd been telling people I was probably dead for months. Some of our old friends had actually started to believe it, which explained why nobody had tried to contact me recently. He'd been spreading this narrative about my disappearance like it was fact instead of just admitting that we'd had a falling out. The process server called me later that day to check in and make sure everything was okay. He said he'd been serving papers for over 15 years and had never encountered anything like this before. He seemed genuinely concerned about the family drama he'd stumbled into and offered to be a witness if I needed one for any legal proceedings. I started thinking about whether I should press charges or take some kind of legal action. What my brother had done felt like fraud, even if he hadn't actually collected any money yet. The insurance company was definitely interested in investigating, since they'd been prepared to pay out a substantial claim based on false information. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that pursuing legal action would just drag out the whole mess and keep me connected to someone I'd been trying to distance myself from. Sometimes the best revenge is just living well and proving that you're better off without certain people in your life. I did contact the insurance company to make sure they understood that I was very much alive and that any claims filed by my brother should be considered fraudulent. They were surprisingly understanding about the whole situation and said they'd make a note in their system to prevent any future issues. The story somehow made its way around our old social circle, probably because my brother had to explain to people why his plan to collect my life insurance had failed so spectacularly. I started getting calls and messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, all wanting to know if I was really okay and what had happened between us. Most of them seemed genuinely relieved to hear from me, but a few admitted they'd actually believed my brother's story about me being missing or dead. That stung more than I expected, knowing that people who'd known me for years could so easily accept that I'd just vanished without trying to verify it themselves. The whole experience made me realize how easy it is to disappear from people's lives, even when you're still very much alive. I'd been so focused on dealing with my own grief and starting over that I hadn't considered how my absence might be interpreted by others. In trying to protect myself, I'd inadvertently given my brother the opportunity to control the narrative about my life. I ended up reconnecting with a few old friends who reached out after hearing about the courthouse incident. It felt good to have people in my life again who actually cared about my well-being, instead of just seeing me as a potential source of money. These conversations helped me realize how isolated I'd become and how much I'd been missing human connection. My brother made a few more attempts to contact me after the hearing, but I ignored them all. He sent long text messages apologizing and trying to explain his actions, but nothing he said could undo what he'd done. The trust between us had been completely shattered, and I couldn't see any way to rebuild it. A few weeks later, I heard through mutual friends that he'd moved to another state, probably to escape the embarrassment of his failed scheme. People in small towns have long memories, and I imagine it was hard for him to show his face around our hometown after word got out about what he'd tried to do. The insurance company ended up flagging his social security number in their system to prevent any future fraudulent claims. They said this kind of thing was more common than people realized, especially in families where there had been disputes over money or property. It was a sobering reminder of how financial desperation can make people do terrible things. Looking back, I think my brother genuinely believed he could get away with it because he'd convinced himself that I was probably dead anyway. In his mind, he wasn't committing fraud, he was just making official what had already happened. It was a twisted form of rationalization that let him sleep at night while planning to profit from my supposed death. The process server and I actually became friends after the whole incident. He said serving those papers had been the highlight of his career, because he'd never gotten to deliver documents to someone who was supposed to be dead. He jokes that he's probably the only process server in history who's ever brought someone back from the dead just by knocking on their door. I've moved to a different city since then and started using a P.O. box for my mail to make it harder for anyone to track me down again. It's not that I'm hiding. I just value my privacy more now and don't want to make it easy for people to find me unless I want them to. The whole experience taught me that sometimes disappearing from toxic relationships is the healthiest choice you can make. The $25,000 is still sitting in my life insurance policy, and I've added a clause that specifically prevents my brother from being able to make any claims on it. It's a small policy anyway, but I don't want him to get any ideas if something actually does happen to me someday. I've named a local charity as my beneficiary instead. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the process server hadn't been so persistent in tracking me down. My brother might have actually succeeded in having me declared dead, and I would have found out about it when I tried to renew my driver's license or apply for a job. The bureaucratic nightmare of proving you're alive when the government thinks you're dead would have been infinitely worse than the embarrassment he faced in that courtroom. The whole situation reinforced my belief that family relationships aren't automatically sacred just because you share DNA with someone. My brother showed me exactly what I meant to him when he thought he could profit from my death, and that's not something I can forget or forgive. Some bridges are meant to be burned, and some doors are meant to stay closed forever. I still live quietly and keep to myself, but now it's by choice rather than necessity. I've learned to appreciate the peace that comes with cutting toxic people out of your life, even when those people are family members who society says you should love unconditionally. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who don't value your existence, except as a potential source of money. The courthouse incident happened almost 3 months ago now, and I haven't heard from my brother since. I hope he's learned something from the experience and is working on becoming a better person, but that's not my responsibility anymore. I've got my own life to live, and I'm finally in a place where I can do that without looking over my shoulder or worrying about what schemes people might be cooking up behind my back. Every now and then I think about that moment when my brother turned around and saw me standing in the courtroom. The look of shock and horror on his face was probably worth more than the $25,000 he'd been trying to steal. Sometimes the universe has a perfect sense of timing, and that day it delivered justice in the most poetic way possible.